vuelta, gente. Gracias por estar
And
ahí.
we're back. Thank you for being with us today. Now, the next presentation is really important. I don't know if you remember the second day we had a presentation from Goran Marby, who talked about several organizations that coordinate internet and the IPs and the DNS, and he mentioned the reads, which are the international registries, and ours is a regional internet registry for the Latin America and Caribbean regions and is based in Uruguay. Its CEO is Oscar Robles Garay, who is joining us today. Oscar, welcome to the 13th edition of the South School of Internet Governance. Oscar has always been close to us in person when we could, and now he's accompanying us online. You must be very busy because next year is your regional LACNIC meeting. These are very interesting meetings. Lots of people go. They're very key for the region. And I see it's a hybrid meeting, so perhaps you can tell us later what your experience is, how you're planning this, because we've been doing online meetings for the last 2 years at the school, but we are hoping to return to in-person meetings sooner rather than later. Adriana is saying, waving at you from over at the back. This kind of TV studio here in Buenos Aires. And Oscar Mesano is also waving to me from the other side of the studio. Thank you for being with us today. Welcome. We look forward to hearing from you. We have some 500 interns, mostly from Latin America, but as this is online, and we've always had simultaneous translation into English, we have people who are taking part from all over the world. And we've introduced something new this year. We've had an 8-week course during August and September, which is something that the interns have asked us for in earlier years, because they wanted a bit more information before the week so they could make the most of all the speeches. So we held a special online course. So people who complete both instances will get a special certificate. Thank you for joining us. Oscar, over to you. Tell us about what you think about how internet can work as a tool for economic recovery post-pandemic. And tell us as well about all the things that pretty much came to a halt after the pandemic. This is the general subject. I'm sure that you'll be able to share with us your vision of this subject, particularly as you head up such an important organization as the LACNIC. Welcome. Thank you very much, Olga. Hi, everybody. Hi, Oscar. Thank you for inviting me to this event, and congratulations for this initiative and for keeping it going even in such difficult times for everyone. It's been difficult, personal and organizational level, really. So here we've actually been just carrying out our general rehearsal for the event next week. And we are making the most of the fact that some in-person options are opening up in Montevideo, so we can have people actually attending our event and seeing how we're going to manage this in the new normal. Before, with online events, people could take part online, but there wasn't the depth of immersion that we are seeking now. So we'll tell you how it goes. Now, today, what I want to talk about is the conditions that have to be in place for internet to play the role of being the principal development tool for economic recovery. Not just economic recovery, but also emotional, educational, all of these processes which were interrupted by the pandemic. So here goes my presentation. I think that everybody can see it, right? I'll tell you just a little briefly about what LACNIC is and what I do, what we do. LACNIC, as Olga said, is one of the 5 regional registers which assigns numbers. We're talking about IP numbers and ISDNs, DNSs, which are the ones that identify the networks. Our job is to make it easier to identify devices on internet. We have a very specific technical task before us. You can put together functions in a database, but it's a fairly important function. Beyond being something simple, the list of who has what resources, it is essential to ensure the correct functioning of internet. We handle 12,000 entities in the region, and they all have IP numbers, whether it's for their own structures or for the services they provide to third parties, such as end consumers or organizations or governments. So our job is quite specific and quite concrete, and it's also very important. We think that the most important thing that we do is that obviously we have to do our basic job properly, which is to administrate resources, but also we have to drive a growing community, a developed community, which will allow us to continue building these technological blocks, developing the technological capabilities of the region, the understanding of new resources, understanding and relationships between governments, private entities, and people, and how we build this collaboration to benefit internet. And that's where we think we have our key role to play. If we don't do what we do, we can't do anything else. Thanks to our commitment to the desire to build better internet, we have the task with LACNIC, which are colleagues from Asia Pacific, to study which aspects were decisive, which technical aspects were decisive in the success that today we see internet having. Now, as I said, in this study, which we commissioned to Mason, whose results we will be publishing at the end of the year, the idea is to make it clear which aspects we need to look out for when we create regulations, when we accept new business models, when we create laws that tackle sensitive aspects in a given country, but which could also affect key elements for internet. So what I want to explain to you is why I think that internet can be an instrument to promote greater development, this recovery in so many different areas. For 50 years, internet has shown itself to be scalable, flexible, and adaptable to new applications. 50 years ago, we didn't have the technologies there were today. We didn't have the infrastructure that we have today. And despite all of that, its main protocols are maintained. Its key technical principles have been maintained. Now, recently, internet has shown its resilience in other aspects, its ability to resist massive impacts on its operations. During 2020, which was a very challenging in many ways for us, but it would have been far worse if we hadn't had such a versatile and resilient medium as internet. In this graph, we can see the continuity and the amount of traffic generated during the pandemic. These are data from 2020 and the number of terabytes traffic. Something that this graph doesn't show isn't just the scale of the change, but the kinds of data that were being exchanged. After 2020, it wasn't the same. Users were consuming hours and hours of films and YouTube videos, TikTok, Instagram, and all these social networks. Videos which were recorded in Twitch and other platforms. It's not the same as this changed in 2020. The number of hours spent on video conferences, which all had to happen at the same time. There was no way of being able to store this on an ISP so that they could be consulted at a later date by anybody. At the end of the day, the videos had taken place during a video conference, and there was no need to store it. But the point is that you had to send it from one point to another immediately, not like traditional videos which were stored. Well, Internet took care of all of that, thanks to its flexibility of its protocols. And this means that Internet will continue to be a highly valuable tool for times like this, even in normal times. Now, for this to happen, Internet has to maintain certain features so that it can truly be an economic recovery tool for education, for people's relationships, and all these things I said earlier. It has to maintain these features. Internet isn't an entity that takes care of itself. We have to be careful about how we deal with the criteria, because if we don't look after it, we will lose this tool that we need so badly. It's important to maintain certain technical features which have enabled it to grow, but there are certain others which are not technical. First, there has to be internet for everybody, pervasiveness. It's not just for a select few. I'm going to explain what this means in a minute. The second is speed and capabilities, the enough bandwidth to allow people to work in a quality environment. The third has to do with quality. It's not about speed, but the features of the internet. What does it allow me to do? Not so much in terms of speed, it's not about watching a video in 4K, but can I use an application without being blocked? Do I have the ability to use a new protocol without having to ask permission all the time? And the fourth item is sustainability, which is an area where we all have to play a role. It's about taking sustainable decisions. Now, I'm going to explain each one of these in greater detail. The first was pervasiveness. This is penetration, really. It's got to be about penetration. This slide shows us that there are some 30% of Latin Americans who are in digital darkness. Latin America has one of the lowest average income per user. It's something between $6 and $8. So it's quite a challenge when it comes to making investments. According to the LACNIC, $170 billion are needed to deploy 5G in the region, not just urban areas, many of which are already connected, but to reach more remote areas such as rural areas. So it's difficult to envisage connecting that 30% with traditional mechanisms. It's not going to happen. We need diverse solutions. And that's where we think that a role has to be played by different entities, including you interns. I really hope that you will get involved, because if we don't tackle this aspect of pervasiveness, internet penetration, we are giving up on the fact that it's a tool for everybody. And it'll just be for a select few, like what has happened with so many different resources. So we have different roles. The state should privilege access over its revenue interests, particularly when it comes to spectrum allocation. Regulators have the opportunity to modify regulatory framework to allow for small Wi-Fi ISPs. This happens to some extent, but it's not broadly based enough. And it is also one of the most sustainable mechanisms to achieve connectivity in low-density areas. It doesn't solve all access problems, but it certainly helps. And there isn't going to be one single solution. We have to find several diverse, creative solutions, and above all, they have to be numerous. And of course, they have to be sustainable. This is, in fact, sustainable. But even when you have Wi-Fi ISPs, if they disappear, another one will take its place, and the effect on the aggregate will be quite reduced. Obviously, the families directly involved will be affected, but as a whole, the general connectivity project will not be affected, because there's always going to be another supplier that's going to step into the breach. So it is a sustainable project. Regulators have the opportunity to favor the secondary use of the spectrum for NGOs and community collective networks, which are not commercial. Or maybe there are some commercial projects, but they won't make much of a difference to the main uses of the spectrum. That would be really great. Also, for those taking part in university projects, in creative and innovative projects, there are many opportunities to encourage access. On the top right, there's a picture of Bhutan. This project was acknowledged because of its innovative capacity, because it took advantage of the white spaces on the television spectrum, allowing many different communities in Bhutan to access an Ethernet network. It was like a local area network. These are highly remote communities, and they're all at some distance from each other. Civil society, universities, and the private sector all have a role to play to promote different ideas, creative solutions to tackle this challenge, which could end up benefiting many people. This is what I think is the most important solution and subject, because if we don't deal with this, it will be far harder to tackle the problem of the 30% of Latin Americans living in digital darkness. The second issue is speed. This is a list I found in politisados.com. It made a bit of sense when you look at the numbers. The key thing is the following. Let's go halfway down this list, which seem to have quite a good average percentage on the whole, which is the problem. Average speed of internet in the region these are megabytes per second. It seems to be reasonably good. And they're all countries are pretty much in the par except for Venezuela, which is right down at the bottom. The problem is that when you have an average, when there's always going to be a problem with an average, when somebody is eating, somebody else isn't. So this means that somebody might have 70 or 75 megabytes per second, and there are many people who simply aren't connected, and also many who are paying for poor access. There's a specific case in Colombia. This is based on data on Mintic. They published that they have an average speed of 11.5 megabytes per second. Maybe that's enough in some cases, but it might be sufficient to maintain some decent job for education using all these online tools. But the problem is that when you do averages, there are always people who are at the bottom of the scale who face far greater challenges. And we can see that there are some districts in Colombia which have significant challenge, because this is merely an average. We're talking about the average, not about those who are worst off. So in these departments, they probably have an even poorer connectivity. And no, it isn't just Colombia. This actually is a reflection of what goes on all over Latin America. Nowhere is safe from this kind of measurement. There might be some more privileged areas in the region, but we're not talking about them. We're talking about most people, most communities who are paying an access. They're no longer in the digital darkness, but they're paying for something that is insufficient. They can't work properly. They can't access decent education because they can't watch videos. They can't connect to a video conference for work. And they can't access a decent job these days. So they're being marginalized. So the kind of internet that we should be trying to achieve with pervasiveness also has to have the capacity to allow people to make the most of all the options. You might say the solution is 5G. No, it's not. Neither for internet penetration nor for speed, because we'll only get internet speed for those who already have a significant speed. And so the only thing we'll end up doing is that those who have greater speed will have better quality videos. Obviously, that's better for their work, but that isn't what we're trying to tackle. What we're looking at is the area below the average. This is what we should be focusing on. And the other issue with 5G is that the density of antenna required to provide coverage is very, very high. It's in fact far greater than the number of 4G antennae. And this could be resolved in the future, but the problem is that it requires high population density for it to be profitable. So we're not going to be saying 5G in rural areas or up in the mountains, because it doesn't make business sense. So we have to rule out that solutions to connectivity be based on these criteria. the 30%, 50% are not a case for business interests. So we have to break a paradigm here. We need carrier concessions are already functioning, and luckily we already have 70% connectivity, right? But what do we do with the other 30%? We have to offer them new ideas, new mechanisms, and new solutions with a commitment from more organizations, not merely the commercial interests of a telecoms carrier. So back to the issue of speed. The third aspect is a little bit more complex, or it's probably more technical. Internet can be criticized for many things, but something that should be valued as a major advantage is that it has the capability to adjust and introduce new protocols which have strengthened it and updated it. But the problem is that not all networks have taken the time or the trouble to update their networks, and that does lead to problems, operational problems with vulnerabilities, with security, and that has an impact on end users. We're also talking about other parties who are involved. You might say this is a problem of the ISPs, but it's not just their problem. Sometimes through the regulators, we can achieve things. But this isn't about legislation or regulation. I'm not talking about regulatory mechanisms as such. What I'm saying is that regulators, because of their role, can encourage these conversations when it comes to, for instance, IP version 6 or RPKI. How can you promote secure and safe practices and avoid problems such as what happened with the outage of the Facebook network? Universities, because of their neutrality and because of their involvement from the point of view that they're not seeking profit, they're non-profit organizations, and civil society have something very important to say about all these aspects, because they're focused on maintaining secure internet, making sure people can trust internet transactions, people should be able to use it for what we were saying to begin with, so that it is an enabler of rights, so that internet can enable economic recovery. And this is something we should focus on. What can we do with internet? However, there are some things where we need to be careful, things that we shouldn't do. All of these initiatives, the outages, the filters, new apps, well, things like Uber or WhatsApp, all of these apps which sometimes scare a few regulators or law enforcement agencies because of inappropriate uses or inappropriate content, which at times is quite relevant. All of these blocking initiatives have consequences, and not all practices to block sites, all of those efforts to block internet are relevant to combat what it is that they want to block. Maybe they want to block an application and it's never been effective, or they want to block piracy of TV signals for football matches, and they haven't achieved that either. And on the way, what's happened is that they've taken down things that are so much more important than the problem they were trying to tackle. We're talking about networks for organizations which are not actually involved in piracy, because not enough attention is placed on what needs to be blocked. So there are kind of these loopholes, these gaps are created in internet. And that's what I wanted to show you with this piece of holy cheese, this piece of Gruyere. The net is full of holes because there are resources that cannot be used because some regulators have decided to, or judges have decided to block them, and nobody is following this up in terms of saying when they no longer need to be blocked. Maybe these resources are being used by someone in a perfectly legitimate way. These practices are not only a challenge to internet operability, but are also dangerous because what is at stake are far more relevant aspects. There are reasons which are totally valid to block sites. For instance, when somebody's life is at risk, or people's health, or urgent issues which requires this. But it has to be done very carefully to avoid unwanted consequences. The LACNIC has pronounced itself on these regulatory aspects, which regulators and aspects need to handle. If they truly decide that this is the last resource to tackle the challenges, you can find this all in my presentation, which I'll be uploading shortly. The third issue related to internet quality has to do with a technical aspect which has to do with openness and the design of internet per se. As a result of this study, we've had the opportunity to talk to many of the original designers, the fathers or pioneers of internet, who were involved in internet design. What they've made very clear is that the openness of internet didn't happen by chance. It was done deliberately. The protocols defined to support the definition of internet were always open. Nobody ever had to pay for them, and nobody has to pay for them. Nobody has to pay to use the HTTP protocol or the mail protocol. If somebody decides they want to send mails, no one has to pay loyalties to their ISP, for instance. If someone decides to download a definition of these standards, they're completely freely available, unlike other protocols which are closed, where somebody has to pay for membership to understand them and then a royalty fee to use them in order to profit from these definitions. So internet was never defined like this. It was also defined in layers, which allows people to give it different uses and for different purposes, unlike other networks for other projects which have a specific purpose. The analogy here is these little toys that you get in the McDonald's Happy Boxes. They're very specific. And then there are other options of toys which create multiple possibilities. The chance to build something with Lego is incredibly diverse, and that's internet, because through its layered model, new technologies can be created for radio, satellite or fiber optics, which perhaps didn't exist to begin with when internet began. But these have now developed and can continue to be a part of this network of networks. New protocols, new apps can be placed in layers upon layers, which are solid with infinite possibilities. Now, what is something that we need to be careful about is that any regulation has to respect these models because they're key for internet scalability. If internet had not been open from the beginning, it would never have reached this broad-based aspect. We wouldn't have reached the degree of innovation that we have today. There are all kinds of challenges, blockchain, in private, public, signatures, encryption. All of this works on the basis of these elements. So, permissionless innovation is key to internet. And as long as this works, as if this doesn't work, internet won't work either. And finally, we're talking about a sustainable internet. Decision-making processes need to be open and multi-stakeholder. We cannot afford to allow decision-making authority to fall into the hands of a single entity, whether it's a social network, a government, a person, or a company. We cannot afford to do this because decisions are becoming more and more complex. Let me explain what happens with LACNIC. We've been using a participative model for the last 20 years where we have a set of rules for our services. I don't draw up the rules, neither my staff, but the community. The community is anybody who's interested in contributing to the definition of these rules. And we've been doing this for 20 years. In fact, 2020, we celebrated our 20th anniversary of the definition of policies, which we launched in Buenos Aires, where Olga and Adriana are today. That was where we have our first forum, it's where we launched our first exercise. After that, LACNIC was consolidated at institutional level in 2002. So next year we'll be turning 20. But the process to define our policies goes back to the year 2000. Internet will increasingly have more complex decision-making capabilities. The way in which these processes have to work is key to take into account different points of view and diverse stakeholders, and not just different perspectives. These have to come from different interests as well. There will obviously be commercial interests as well as state interests, but there should also be non-commercial interests from civil society and academia, whose interest is perhaps more theoretical and focused on the development of solutions rather than on profit as such of an application. We need to value the role played by academia in our processes and ensure that civil society can strengthen its involvement. And that's why I turn to you, dear interns, so that you can also play an important role in this process. Lastly, Internet isn't magic. All of this success, this growth, this adaptability over the last 50 years, it's actually going to be turn 51 in 20 days, has been a careful and deliberate process of different elements and different people which different people have put at the disposal of humanity. But there are threats present. Regulations are an important threat. We're talking about, there obviously are sensible ones too, right? But there always are some very reasonable efforts to order things, but there are others too which seek to attack internet because of the freedom it offers, because of the threats it presents to other processes. It's not just about stopping child pornography or child abuse or national security, which are very valid concerns, and there are essential aspects which the state must bear in mind, because what they are doing is protecting people's lives. But these are sometimes used as excuses rather than as a real purpose. So we must be careful about all the initiatives which seem to have a sensible objective, but could in fact have the unwanted consequence of distorting some of the aspects that we've talked about: growth, scalability, flexibility and adaptability, and resilience. To summarize, we must ensure that this internet, which has had such growth and scalability over the last 51 years, we must ensure that it can work for the next 50 years to guarantee human rights, to guarantee the development of education and people's relationships. There are many challenges ahead, and there are many things that internet must keep up to date. Not internet itself, obviously, but us as part of internet, always seeking consensus, multi-stakeholder participation to ensure that all of these elements remain in place. Well, thank you very much. Here are some references if you're interested. And any questions? Thank you, Oscar. That was a really interesting presentation. If you could send that presentation, because my interns are asking for it. Yes, of course, I'd be delighted to. I love the Lego analogy. I remember when I used to play with my kids and make things with Lego. I always tell my students about the importance of open standards, free standard things you don't have to pay for. And this has been the basis for the broad-based and persistent development of internet over the years. And I always talk about this, so it's good to hear you say it too. And congratulations for the next 20 years for the development of policies. I have a few questions from our interns.
Me gustaría preguntar cuál es la agenda post-pandemia de LACNIC y los NRO.
They say that this is very important. What is the agenda of LACNIC and post-COVID-19? And if you can refer to other programs that are conducted by LACNIC, SDG, ITC, Goals Global, and LACNIC. Yes. LACNIC played a role very, very smoothly in the pandemic, trying to keep the biannual events or hosting the biannual events. The rates that are involved host 2 annual events, and we were the ones to start with the online events, and we're going to start right now with the hybrid events. Probably next year we are going to host all hybrid events. With the executive directors of the 5 REITs, we are going to start strategically planning every 5 or 6 years. This time it took us 7 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but as soon as we get back to the in-person conferences, we want to resume that, because virtually, or to hold these conferences online is very demanding, and probably it's not of the same quality. In connection with the other LACNIC initiatives, if you look for FRIDA, the FRIDA program, you have the awards or the prizes that were awarded to 17 projects in 3 pillars or themes, precisely the topics that we just discussed. We try to promote creativity, innovation within the community, and to award a prize so these initiatives could become more relevant for the region. Additionally, some years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we conducted IGTIC and IGTIC 2 That was another initiative. It's a combination of the way IT people refer to IT, that is IGT, and the ICTs. So that's why we combine ICTs plus IT, okay? So we started conducting efforts on basic talent to ICT because we're far from what we can take to some other countries in the region. However, they really appreciate this. They're very appreciative of our efforts, and we did it together with the IRDC. As a matter of fact, they supported a lot of resources for this to fund this project, and we had great results. These efforts made are translated in the training courses imparted, like security courses or the network security courses that was organized particularly for IGT, and I'm sure that you can participate in these conferences. This was the original initiative in IGT. Good, and the last comment, or the last question in connection with your comments, regarding the implementation of 5G. Disadvantages and what would be the opportunities to improve connectivity or speed and to reduce the digital divide in our region. 4G or 3G do not pose any problems for the 98% of the activities over the internet. Obviously, there are things that will require 5G or the promising 5G speed, okay? However, it's not a matter of coming or not. I mean, 5G development is coming, but I'm against the state allocating federal resources to promote 5G because that is not where the needs of those users are going to be covered, okay? Especially people in the most vulnerable sectors of society. I mean, the state is going to be present, but it's not going to serve for those sectors. So it would be kind of regrettable, controversial. So beyond the challenge being the access, having access to 3G or standard broadband, that would be good, or that would be solving partially the problem. But it's not the way we the way we solve low quality broadband, for example, in Mexico. The problem is that these networks are saturated. I mean, the benefits that they're going to get, I mean, it depends on the benefits or the investments that they're going to make. But if they have these stringent regulations with the regulatory framework, that is going to prevent them from making further investments. There's no business, there's no economic interest, and there are no people or investors making the necessary investments to serve these markets, okay? And that is the issue. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you for your presentation. We can share your PowerPoint if you want to. Thanks a lot. On behalf of the students here at the South School of Internet Governance, especially with this hybrid conference that you're hosting, I'm sure that it's going to be successful. It's a new modality, and you learn by doing. For example, we are online, and I know that we are going to return to hybrid conferences. Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch. Stay tuned, and I'm sure that we're going to see you pretty soon in the future. Adrian says hi, Oscar says hi, and also the team. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that we're going to find an excuse to visit Argentina. Thanks a lot. Goodbye. Thanks.